I have spent time listening to the voices of young men and women across the 5 states that make up the Igbo heartland: Abia State, Anambra State, Ebonyi State, Enugu State, and Imo State. And the stories they tell have opened my eyes to a deep well of fear, anger, frustration, and betrayal. When the Nigerian army places a recruitment poster in a town square or airs a heartfelt plea on the radio, they cannot see the faces behind the numbers. They cannot feel the weight of history that each young person carries in their heart, nor can they know how recent events have hardened that heart against the very institution that claims to protect it. Over the past decade, stories have spread across the southeastern region of Nigeria about young men being stopped on the road, questioned, sometimes beaten, and in the worst cases, shot. I have talked with families whose sons vanished during midnight raids, whose younger brothers still tremble at the sound of helicopter blades overhead. When you grow up in a place where every uniformed soldier is seen as a potential executioner, how do you volunteer to become one? Many of these young people point to the shadowy figure of the indigenous people of Biafra, known by its acronym rather than its full name. Yet I have found they would rather speak openly without shorthand so that their stories are not lost. The movement that calls itself the indigenous people of Biafra says its goal is to defend the rights of Igbo people. Yet in the eyes of many southeastern youth, the Nigerian army does not distinguish between those two words, Igbo and battle. When soldiers move through their towns, they see not strangers on patrol, but an occupying force that views them as enemy combatants from the moment they reach puberty. On the television screens of homes in Umuahia and Owerri, I have watched Major General Kingsley Owoye appeal for more recruits from southeast Nigeria. He spoke of unity, of national duty, of honoring those who came before us. His words fell flat among the very people he addressed. To them, the wounds of the past are still fresh. They remember how during the Nigerian Civil War, also known as the Biafran War, their parents and grandparents were starved, bombarded and dehumanized because they dared to dream of self-determination. They remember the promises that came after the war, promises that never materialized, that left entire regions impoverished and neglected. They have seen politicians speak of reconciliation while turning a blind eye to the clusters of burnt-out villages where their neighbors were massacred as recently as 5 years ago. In the rural hinterlands of Imo State, I met a group of farmers who asked not to be identified for fear of reprisals. They told me that even though the headline violence in some southeastern towns has subsided, the killing in the farmlands never stopped. Men vanish at night while tending to their yam fields. Women walk home alone at dusk, fearful that they will not make it past the bush. On one evening in September, 2 farmers were shot dead while returning from a distant farm. Their families still await answers. No suspect has been arrested, no investigation opened in public, and no apology offered. There is a narrative that unknown gunmen are responsible for this insecurity. Sometimes people whisper that those gunmen are not so unknown, that they operate with the tacit approval of certain politicians who fear the rise of any strong Igbo youth movement. Perhaps these masked men carry weapons obtained through channels that bypass official military logistics. Some suspect that the very army whose presence they resent has itself promoted this cycle of chaos in order to justify its continued heavy deployment in the region. If there is danger, soldiers claim, then soldiers must stay. And if a soldier sees someone in the bush after curfew, that soldier can open fire without asking questions. It is a perfect catch-22. In the town of Niwi, I spoke with a former trainee who had been accepted into the Naval Training School, but abandoned the process just before graduation. He looked me in the eye and said, "I do not want to die for people who see me as a problem to be solved, not as a son to be protected." He told me that his uncle had been arrested one night by the Nigerian army when he was on his way home, accused of being an ipob terrorist. The uncle spent 2 weeks in detention, beaten and denied access to a lawyer before being released without charges, only to discover that his farm had been overtaken by strangers. How can a young man join an institution that will criminalize him before he even steps through the gate? Some of the most alarming stories come from the Nemba region, where there have long been clashes between the federal military and local militias fighting over oil-rich land. Even though Nemba is geographically in the south-south, the spirit of suspicion has flowed eastward. The memory of a 2016 operation in which soldiers burned down entire compounds still lingers. Young men there tell me that they thought they were fighting militants, but when the smoke cleared, they found their own neighbors' bodies among the ruins. Many voices in the southeast also point to the controversial figure of Moses Asari Dokubo, often introduced simply as Asari Dokubo, but who insists on being called by his full name, Moses Asari Dokubo. He was once a militant leader in the Niger Delta, advocating for resource control. In recent years, he shocked some by claiming that he had a contract from the federal government to carry out operations against certain groups in the southeast. Whether his statements are entirely accurate or not, they fed into a narrative that the federal authorities are willing to employ shadowy security solutions that operate outside any legal or moral framework. If that is the case, they worry, then the next contract could be for them. I recall a meeting with a group of community organizers in Onitsha who had pulled themselves together to form their own local security committees. They called themselves Amotekun, a Yoruba word meaning leopard, borrowed from a similar group in the neighboring Yoruba region. They explained that when the Nigerian army withdrew from patrolling the markets and the bush paths, they took up machetes and radios and set up checkpoints. They invited the police to train them and even introduced a code of conduct to ensure they would not become the very threat they were trying to thwart. Their story shows that when the federal forces step back, ordinary people will step forward, not to sign up for the army, but to protect their own families. In Ebonyi State, I met a young woman named Chinyere Nwosu, who had served in a women's paramilitary unit during her university days. She said bluntly that the reason there are fewer killings in the towns today is not because any separatist leader is behind bars, but because local people refused to be sitting ducks. They formed neighborhood watch groups. They communicated via WhatsApp when they saw strange motorcycles passing by, and they alerted their governors when they felt the security forces were failing them. They saved lives, but they did not ask their children to don the green camouflage of the Nigerian army. For them, self-help was better than enlistment. Across social media platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, I have watched dozens of videos from Southeastern youth in which they wave their degrees, their technical certificates, and their letters of admission, and then toss them into the air. All over Nigeria, losing your qualifications to a gust of wind is a symbolic act, but in the southeast, it is also a declaration of defiance. They say, "I will not serve an army that serves me only bullets and suspicion." One young man in Enugu State even set his recruitment forms on fire to show that no amount of propaganda would convince him to overlook the memories of family members who were shot at dawn. I know it can be tempting to dismiss these sentiments as mere social media noise, but when I sat in a room with 20 would-be recruits in Owerri and heard the same arguments stated in hushed tones, I realized this is a widespread phenomenon, not a fringe view. They feel marginalized, believing that the Nigerian army sends them to the most dangerous hotspots while recruits from other regions are spared. They point to press reports showing that soldiers from southwestern Nigeria are often deployed to peacekeeping missions abroad or humanitarian duties in the hinterland, while those from Kebbi State or Kano State are rotated away from conflict zones whenever possible. The sense of unfairness festers. One former aspirant from Abia State named Emeka Uchenna told me he applied twice to join the infantry and was rejected. Later, he attempted to become a military engineer, but again he did not make the cut. He says that each rejection broke his spirit. and today he questions what he ever hoped to achieve by defending a nation he says would not defend him. He now works as a security guard in Lagos, far from home, and he still wonders whether he should have stayed and opened his own agro-processing business instead of chasing a uniform. At the same time, recruiters for the Nigerian army admit that the southeast is one of the zones that recruiters have the hardest time filling. They speak in code about operational requirements and zonal quotas, but it all adds up to the same thing. The region that once sent thousands of men into the trenches during the Nigerian Civil War is now one of the very last places where young people want to wear the country's green beret. When I asked a recruitment officer in Port Harcourt why that might be, he hesitated. Then he said, "We do not have the same history here. We have to work harder." Some analysts connect the situation in the southeast to the broader pattern of violence in the Middle Belt, a swath of central states like Benue State and Plateau State, where clashes between farmers and Fulani herders have turned entire villages into ghost towns. Villagers accuse the federal government of being complicit by failing to disarm the militia groups that roam the farmlands at will. They say the same officials who know where the gunmen are hiding choose not to act because of political alliances or because they believe the costs of intervention outweigh the benefits. If a government can look at living, breathing citizens being slaughtered and shrug, what message does that send to young people who are considering whether they should become the government's foot soldiers? I flew to Makurdi, the capital of Benue State, and met with farmers who described how armed men in military fatigues moved into their compound one morning, shooting at cattle and burning granaries full of maize. They laughed bitterly when I asked if the Nigerian army responded. They said the nearest patrol team arrived 3 days later, by which time the herders had already driven off the livestock and retreated into the hills. If the official response is that slow, they asked, how effective could it possibly be when the same army is entrusted with national defense? I brought these stories back to a retired rear admiral, whose full name is Emmanuel Ogalaj. He had served in the Nigerian Navy during some of the darkest chapters of the country's history. Admiral Ogalaj spoke to me with a calm authority. He said that when people lose faith in their armed forces, the very fabric of society frays. He acknowledged that some governors have tried to authorize community policing initiatives, but he lamented that the federal government has often undermined those efforts, disarming local vigilantes at the first sign of tension. He asked, what is the point of an army if it cannot protect the communities that volunteer to help it? Through all these conversations, a common theme emerged. Trust is in short supply. Young men and women want to believe in something bigger than themselves. They want to serve their country, to hold the flag high. But before they can do that, they need to believe that their country would serve them in return. They need assurances that when they raise their right hand to swear allegiance, their families back home will be safe. They need clarity on who exactly unknown gunmen are and why anyone who resists them is treated as a criminal. They need transparent investigations into past abuses, with commanders held accountable rather than promoted. Recently, as a gesture of goodwill, the Chief of Army Staff, whose complete name is Lieutenant General Taurid Lagbaja, visited Enugu State. He held a press conference in which he emphasized the inclusive nature of the military and rolled out a new recruitment incentive package. Financial allowances for recruits from underrepresented zones, guaranteed education scholarships, and a community engagement fund that would allow local youth organizations to plan development projects. The package was meant to show that the Army values Southeastern youth not just as soldiers, but as stakeholders in the nation's progress. Yet even these overtures have been met with skepticism. I attended that press conference and watched as dozens of young people sat stiffly in their chairs, arms crossed, eyes scanning the exits. When the general finished his speech, one student asked him how many soldiers from Enugu State were currently leading battalions in the Northeast counter-insurgency campaign. He stammered, glanced at his notes and said he would provide the data later. A ripple of laughter ran through the hall. That moment spoke volumes. A promise of inclusion rings hollow when it is not backed by names, numbers and timelines. I believe that if the Nigerian army truly wants to win the hearts of Southeastern youth, it must go beyond brochures and videos. It must open its archives and show the families of victims what really happened during past operations. It must invite independent observers into its barracks, its training camps and its meeting rooms. It must partner with local leaders who are trusted by the community, even if those leaders have been critical of the army in the past. And above all, it must demonstrate that when a young person signs up, that person will be valued not merely for the firepower they can bring, but for the ideas, the talents, and the hopes they carry. I spoke with a mother in Imo State whose son dreams of becoming a doctor. She told me that if her son could see a clear path where he would serve 2 years in a military hospital, gain practical experience, and then be supported to finish his medical residency, she would proudly give her blessing. She said she would even bake a cake for his passing out parade. That is the kind of personal connection the army has never cultivated in the Southeast. At its core, this is a struggle over narrative. Who controls the story of the Southeast? Who gets to say whether soldiers are heroes or oppressors? Right now, the voices on the ground say that the Nigerian army is a monolithic force that has never fully reckoned with its past, that uses the threat of violence as its primary language. If that narrative does not change, then no amount of recruitment quotas or recruitment videos will fill the barracks. In the coming months, I will continue to follow these stories, to sit in community halls, to record the voices of those who feel left out, and to ask the hard questions of the policymakers in Abuja. I know that many will accuse these youths of being unpatriotic, of letting social media sway them. But my travels have shown me that what they want is not disloyalty. They want fairness. They want to know that their country believes in them, that it trusts them not just when the time comes for war, but in times of peace as well. If the Nigerian army can demonstrate genuine humility, can own up to past mistakes, and can create real mechanisms for dialogue and accountability, then a new generation of Southeastern youth may yet discover the pride in wearing the green uniform. Until then, their reluctance will remain not a mystery, but a mirror reflecting the trust deficit that every institution in Nigeria must strive to heal.